Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's show. My name is Spencer Walsh, and we have a good one for you today, as always, talking about the latest news in the protests and how they're continuing as we get past now the 2-week point of consecutive protests happening both nationwide and worldwide. Also, we're going to take a look at the congressional response as Democrats are unveiling a bill to rein in bias and excessive force in policing. And we're going to be taking a look at what action will be taken, what reform is good reform, and I do want to turn to a little bit more personal issue for me, and that's the reason why we have the wonderful guest that we have on today, a crisis that happened in my own community that I think we will kind of reflect nationally, and it really is an interesting conversation about racism and in general, and especially in places where you don't always expect to find it. Here we have with us today, very glad to have with us on the show, Zane Riemer. I hope I'm saying that right.
Riemer, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, no problem.
On the show today. All right, so first I just want to start with, since you are obviously the first time for you here on this show today, like what has been your reaction, obviously, to the George Floyd killing, of course, the knee of the police, and how have you kind of taken in these protests?
Yeah, well, just the second I saw that video, just disturbing. That's just, it's so hard to see that just being a real thing in our world, especially in the year 2020. So just everyone knows how disgusting that video is, and we see the outcry and the reaction is so vivid, and so there's so much reaction because there needs to be something happening, right? And a lot of these protests, I think, are really inspiring. We see all over. We're seeing in suburban communities. We're seeing in the cities. We're seeing everywhere. We're seeing people are really trying to come together and trying to get their voices heard and get others' voices heard who haven't been listened to for so long. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's really kind of a show of how really effective these protests are. They seem to be getting places that protest in all of their issues, from gun violence to women's rights, have just failed to get. And of course, I think we can't talk about this here as or just give you a little bit of the situation of what's been going on recently. About 1,000 protesters gathered in LA near a memorial for those killed by police. Thousands more called for police reforms in a city council meeting in Charlotte, North Carolina, and more than 1,000 made their way to a march that began in Washington Square Park in Manhattan. This is a young revolution, says Vidal Guzman, as he led marchers down Fifth Avenue, New York. These are teenagers, people in their 20s and 30s. We have energy. We believe in what we're doing, and we're not going to let up. But there's still signs that the demonstrations have began to ramp down in many places. By Monday night in Washington, after more than 40,000 people descended on the nation's capital over the weekend, the city, for the most part, was quiet. What do you make of these kind of protests ebbing, and what do you think is going to be coming next for the movement?
Well, I think next is we have these protests, we have these people getting their voice out, these amazing speeches we've seen throughout the past few weeks, people voicing how they feel, thousands gathering on the streets. Now we need the action, we need to reallocate money from the budgets of the NYPD, the LAPD, the MPD, whatever the police department is. We need to start putting money into other parts of the community. We need to start funding our health cares in these local communities better. We need to start putting more money into education. And I think this is really just a movement against corruption in police. And it's really I think this is really just changing how we look at the authority, right? Who is the authority now?
Yeah, and I think what in terms of efficacy of these protests, we've seen a lot of. Would you say in your evaluation of the things that have been happening so far, how successful have these protests been? I know these are very big questions, but why do you think, in your reading of it, do you think they have been successful? If you do think they have been successful,
well, I think we can just see. So now we see in Minneapolis where the city council has introduced the idea of fully disbanding the MPD. While that could be a very controversial thing, and I can understand to see both sides of people arguing of a full disbandment or just a part or just taking a little bit of funds away from it. We see that there. We see de Blasio has put budget cuts for the NYPD already, and is saying he's putting into social services throughout the city. And we see in LAPD they took 100. I might be wrong with this. It's about $150 million they took out of the LAPD, or whatever number it is. They took money out of the budget and they're putting it into the community. So I think, you know, from that kind of stuff, I think it's been successful. You know, obviously there's been a lot of polarizing news with the protests, but I think what's happening now is showing that these protests and everyone speaking up is working so far.
Yeah, I mean, I really kind of get a sense that this video in a way has really connected with a bunch of other people, just because of the fact that it just seems to be so like just particularly brutal, and just the way, and you can hear and see, even if you haven't watched all 8 minutes 46 seconds of the video, like you can see how devastating it is to anyone. It's just just inexplicable, senseless violence. Yeah. That can really, I think, get to even the most kind of pro-police minds. For example, my dad, like, he's not a super conservative guy. He's not a super liberal guy, but he's definitely a guy who's, like, kind of somewhat distrusting of change, like, big sea change movements of, like, activism that really kind of push boundaries, like, in, I think, the movement this one does. But you could tell he was just absolutely just horrified by the video, as any American would. And I think that the fact that this video is just so particularly bad, it's almost like the police are asking to kind of get defunded with this kind of behavior. Yeah. Do you think the video? Have you noticed in your conversations with, like, maybe some relatives or people that you know who are maybe a bit pro-police, has this video kind of, and this protest and this event made more of an impact on them?
Yeah. I think this video is just so extreme. It is different in the sense that there is no way to argue for the officer's actions. You know, I think in a lot of these cases where the police brutality videos are taken, and we see these videos where obviously I'm always on the side of the person who is being brutalized, but you know, there's a lot of the people try to make arguments and are able to make somewhat intelligible arguments for the police in that side. But I think this video, it's just like there's no explanation for what the officers did, and there is no way you can be the most pro-police person, but you watch that video or you see a clip and you see complete disgrace. It's just disgraceful, and there's no way. Yeah, it's. I've seen, and you know, you even see conservatives in the beginning. It was really like a movement together where everyone was together saying, "This is wrong. The police, all 4 of these officers, should be in trouble." Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's been very, very apparent. And we kind of have begin to see some of them kind of take more of a stance against this, and kind of been able to spin this off as riots, predominantly riots, and like the American police kind of being overrun as our cities are being burned by, you know, these kind of radical Antifa people. Do you think that message has resonated with like a large portion of, not necessarily like people on either side of the spectrum, but kind of just your average Joe who isn't really entirely sure of anything politically? Do you think that message has really resonated in news coverage and the way these events have played out?
I think for the average person who is consuming media from CNN, Fox, MSNBC, and places on Twitter, I think it's important to outsource and find different places, because I do think that a narrative that is being put together right now is definitely trying to put a division in the movement. And I think for the average person, I think that they are aware of what's happening, but I do think that it's becoming a thing where the violence that is happening is being put on the spotlight more than the peaceful protests and the parts of the protests where police are literally going in and like being brutal, right? They're going in and they're tear gassing and they're the grenades and all that, like the light grenades and all that stuff, and you know, I think that gets lost in it.
Yeah, I definitely think so. Like, we've seen just compilations and compilations of just awful videos of
Yeah.
police violence. And for example, I just saw one coming out of Minneapolis, video from Mother Jones showing the police slashing tires of essential workers, medical medical staff, news media, protesters, all those different people. And like, what do you think is? And obviously, we've seen the horrific videos of people just being brutalized and beating up these protesters. What do you think drives this kind of behavior? And
Yeah.
like,
Well, yeah, I've seen this in other places, and I think John Oliver said it too. It's just like in his video today. It's just like you're protesting against police brutality, and to get the police, to work with the community more. And what they're doing is they're just proving the points of everyone. And it's just, I don't know what I think what's another thing is a lot of these police departments think that they are above the law. The police unions are so powerful in protecting police officers, and they're kind of this cult where they will not really suffer the repercussions for their actions, and they can go pepper spray little kids and shoot rubber bullets at teenagers going to protest, and they can pepper spray people as they pass in cars to people just standing there, and they can get away with it because for hundreds of years, police have been on top, and those people in power have had the power, and they'll keep it no matter what. And I think what's happening now is that there's a disrupt in that more than we've seen ever before. I think where even when like Michael Brown happened, and in the riots in Ferguson, or in any other protests we've seen, I think this is the most extreme case of we are done with this unjust authority, and we want change. We want to see funds taken away from these police departments and put into the communities. We want to see, some people are saying we want to defund the police and get rid of police altogether,
Yeah, I think that's definitely, like, it's really kind of telling how so many times, I was talking about this in a video I was doing earlier today, it was just like so many times, so many different issues, it seems like change is like so far out of reach, like so distant, like so like hopeless in so many different issues. And I know I was a big fan of Bernie Sanders, and I was like, I was just like very much disappointed to see the way that like his campaign was dealt with by the ostensible left party of the country.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, it's going to be very, very hard from this point to like attain real quick change. And I just realized, like, I never really thought this would happen. I couldn't even imagine such like massive protests happening. It's really, really cool to see, and very, very telling.
Yeah.
I think to see the way that our police have responded to this.
Definitely.
I've seen a tweet from this guy on Twitter named at Rex Chapman, talking about the Seattle PD hit a 21-year-old female directly in the chest with a stun grenade. Volunteer medics and protesters rushed to her aid. After being carried away, she was unresponsive with no pulse. They revived her. She's in critical condition, luckily. Hopefully she's able to make it out of that. But
yes.
It also kind of shows that there is it kind of goes to the whole situation of good cops versus bad cops. And I've heard from a lot of people who have they started off like people, I think understandably so, they don't want to, especially like white people who don't have a lot of interaction with the police, they don't want to be the first to come out and say, oh, I think the police are bad, I think they're awful, I think like all cops are bastards, or whatever that slogan. And it kind of shows you, I think it's really exemplified in videos where we have that are emerging online today about this. I don't know if you've seen this Philadelphia cop, Joe Bologna or Bologna or something like that. He was coming out of his police union house to turn himself in for brutally beating up a protester, and his entire force was like standing outside clapping.
It's terrible. It's terrible.
And it's just like, they may not be doing the crime, but if they're out there clapping for the guy who did the crime, like, how does that really make a difference?
Yeah, that, and we saw that in Buffalo also.
Yes, that's true.
It's just like, they know that they are going to get away with the things they're doing, and they support each other. It's like, I think that tweet's been going around everywhere, where it's someone saying like, if you have 1,000 good cops, but then 10 bad cops, but the 1,000 good cops don't say anything about the bad cops, you have 1,010 bad cops. Yeah, and I think that is just a true statement. That is it makes sense. It's like, if you want to be a part of this system,